The deed felt like a river stone in her palm, smooth and heavy with time. Eliza stood on the courthouse steps, the August sun pressing down like a physical weight, bleaching the dust of the town square to a pale, hazy bone white. Before her, Mayor Thorne cleared his throat, the sound a dry rasp in the listening silence. His face, usually a mask of practiced warmth, was tight with a satisfaction he could not quite conceal. The townsfolk formed a half-circle around them, their faces pinched with hunger and uncertainty. They were not a jury, not yet, but they were a verdict waiting to be passed. The mayor held up a sheaf of papers, their edges fluttering in the hot, listless breeze. "As you can see," he announced, his voice oiled with false regret, "the original survey of County Parcel 73B, commonly known as the Shale Hill, was improperly filed. A clerical error, you understand. Under the Territorial Emergency Act, given the current drought and the public need for water access, this unrecorded parcel reverts to the public trust. To be auctioned for the good of the community." He looked directly at Eliza, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He was offering her a chance to crumble, to plead. He was offering her the role of the pitiable woman, alone and outmatched. One person alone. It was the town's favorite phrase for her. Behind the mayor, she saw Silas Gable from the Mercantile, his arms crossed, his expression a complicated mix of pity and a grim, undeniable hope that this might solve his own problems. She saw the faces of men whose cattle were dying and women whose gardens had turned to brittle skeletons. They wanted her to be wrong. They needed her to be wrong, because her small, strange success in the face of their universal failure was a mystery that pricked at their pride. Eliza's gaze did not waver. Her thumb traced the embossed seal on the document in her hand. The paper felt different from the mayor's flimsy notices. It felt like bedrock. It felt like truth. 16 months earlier, the hill had been a joke. It was her only inheritance from a father the town remembered as a dreamer who had died with dust in his pockets. The lawyer, a man with a perpetually sympathetic frown, had slid the original deed across his desk. "It's not much, Eliza. 160 acres of shale and scrub. No one's ever gotten a crop off it. Your father thought? Well, he had his ideas. The town's pity was a suffocating blanket. They saw a young woman, not yet 25, left with nothing but a pile of rocks that couldn't even grow decent weeds. You'd have done better to sleep in the street," Silas Gable had told her, not unkindly, when she'd bought a sack of flour and a box of nails. "That place is cursed with worthlessness." Mayor Thorne himself had paid her a visit, his buggy gleaming, his manner a perfect performance of fatherly concern. He'd sat in her father's rickety chair, surveyed the bare cabin, and made his offer. "As a favor to your father's memory," he'd said, his voice low and confidential, "I'll take the parcel off your hands, give you enough to get a decent start in the city. A place like this, it's no place for a woman to be alone." She had listened with a stillness that he mistook for meekness, for fear. She watched his eyes flick toward the ridgeline, a fleeting, acquisitive gleam that he quickly masked. He did not see a worthless hill. He saw something else, but he believed she could not. She thanked him for his kindness and told him she meant to stay. The mayor had left with a shake of his head, the pity in his smile now edged with condescension. The town's verdict was unanimous, prideful, foolish, and soon to be broken. They did not know that Eliza had walked every inch of that land with her father. They did not know that she had learned to see it not for what it lacked, but for what it held. The corn and wheat they all understood withered on its slopes. The grass was thin and bitter. But something else grew there, a tough, scrubby plant with a woody stem and spikes of dusty purple flowers that clung to the cracks in the shale. The townsfolk called it thornbrush or bee nettle and cursed it for snagging their clothes. Her father, a man who read old books, had called it hyssop. And where the hyssop bloomed, the air hummed. The work began before the last of the town's pitying glances had faded. Eliza used the last of her father's savings not on seed corn or a milk cow, but on 20 skeps from a farmer 2 counties over. The man had looked at her, a single woman with a rickety wagon, and asked if she knew what she was doing. She'd simply nodded and paid in coin, her silence a better answer than any argument. The journey back was slow, the wagon buzzing like a trapped nerve. She placed the skeps carefully on the southern face of the hill, on level shelves of rock her father had cleared years before. Day after day, she worked. She hauled water from the deep, slow spring at the base of the hill, a spring everyone dismissed as too small to be useful. She built sturdy wooden stands to lift the hives off the damp ground. Her hands, once soft, grew rough as bark. The callus is a testament to her labor. She rose before the sun, her first thought not of loneliness or fear, but of the bees. She watched them pour from the hives at first light, a shimmering golden river flowing up the hill to the stands of purple hyssop. She learned their language, the low, contented hum of a strong hive, the high-pitched whine of distress, the frantic dance that told of a new source of nectar. At night, in the quiet of the cabin, she did the arithmetic of survival. 20 hives. If even 15 survived the first winter, and each produced 30 pounds of honey, that was 450 pounds. Some for her, to trade for flour and salt. The rest was a secret, a hope she kept banked low like a coal under ash. The town saw her toiling on the barren hill and shook their heads. They saw a woman chasing a fantasy, a fool's errand inherited from a foolish father. They saw the bees and thought of a pleasant hobby, not a livelihood. They could not imagine the sheer scale of the quiet economy humming just beyond their understanding. One afternoon, a figure appeared at her fence line. It was Mrs. Anya Petrova, an old woman who lived on the neighboring plot, a woman who kept to herself and was regarded with the same suspicion reserved for foreigners and fortune-tellers. She said nothing, simply watched with dark, knowing eyes. Eliza, expecting another sermon on her folly, merely nodded and continued her work. The next day, Mrs. Petrova was there again. This time, she held out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. It was a loaf of dark, dense bread, still warm. Eliza took it, her throat tight with a gratitude she could not speak. Mrs. Petrova finally spoke, her voice accented, the words chosen with care. "In my country," she said, gesturing with her chin toward the purple-hazed slope, "we know this plant. It is not pretty. The root is ugly. But the ugliest root makes the sweetest tea." She looked at Eliza, a real smile touching her lips for the first time. "You are not a foolish girl. You are a farmer of what is, not what ought to be." That quiet validation was worth more than a wagon-load of coin. It was the first time someone had looked at her work and seen sense instead of madness. Mrs. Petrova became a silent companion. She never offered advice unless asked, but she would leave a jar of pickled vegetables on the fence post or a small pail of goat's milk. Her presence was a quiet buffer against the town's skepticism. It was also Mrs. Petrova who brought the boy. His name was Leo, a thin, shy child of 10 who was meant to be delivering eggs, but was perpetually distracted by the world. He'd been caught staring, mesmerized, at the river of bees flowing up the hill. Instead of scolding him, Mrs. Petrova had led him by the hand to Eliza's gate. "This one has the seeing eyes," the old woman had said simply. Leo became Eliza's shadow. He was quiet and quick, and his fascination was honest. He was not interested in what the honey was worth, but in how the bees made it. He learned to move slowly, to read the hum of the hives, to never cast a shadow over their entrance. He helped her build new stands and render beeswax into clean, yellow cakes. He was the first person she showed the honey to. When she uncapped the first frame in late summer, the honey that flowed out was unlike anything they sold at the mercantile. It was not the pale gold of clover honey or the light amber of alfalfa. It was a deep, dark, forbidding mahogany, almost black. It was thick as molasses, and the smell that filled the cabin was not of sweetness, but of herbs and earth in the dry, sun-baked shale of the hill itself. "It's dark," Leo whispered, his eyes wide. Eliza dipped a finger in and tasted it. The flavor was overwhelming at first, a powerful, medicinal wave of herbs, followed by a sweetness that was complex and resonant, with a clean, faintly bitter finish. It tasted of the hyssop, of the very land everyone called worthless. She filled a single jar and set it on the windowsill. For a week, She did nothing with it. The arithmetic in her head had changed. This was not simple honey. This was something else entirely. She had to know what it was worth. But being right was a dangerous thing in a town that had already decided you were wrong. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. Finally, she took a jar to Gable's mercantile. Silas Gable looked at the dark, syrupy contents, held it up to the light, and smirked. "What did you do, Eliza?" "Scrape mud out of the creek bed." "It's hyssop honey," she said, her voice steady. "Never heard of it," he sniffed. "Looks more like medicine than food. I'll give you a dime for the jar." Just then, the bell over the door jingled. A man in city clothes, his face pale and unaccustomed to the sun, stepped inside. He carried a leather satchel and looked around the store with a discerning eye. "I'm looking for local botanicals," he announced to Gable. "Wild ginseng, burdock root, that sort of thing." His name was Abernathy, an apothecary from the capital, and he was searching for ingredients for his remedies. Gable shrugged, pointing to a dusty shelf of common herbs. Mr. Abernathy's gaze, however, had fallen on the jar in Eliza's hand. "And what," he asked, his voice suddenly sharp with interest, "is that?" Eliza explained what it was. Mr. Abernathy took the jar from her, unscrewed the lid, and inhaled deeply. His eyes closed. A slow, wondering smile spread across his face. "Incredible," he murmured. He dipped a small wooden spoon from his satchel into the jar and tasted it. The effect was immediate. He stood up straighter, his expression one of professional reverence. "This is not food," he said, looking from the jar to Eliza and back again. "This is a tonic. Hyssop has been used for millennia for coughs, for lung ailments, for purification. A honey this pure, this concentrated. I have read of such things in old European texts, but I have never seen it." Silas Gable stared, his mouth slightly agape. The apothecary turned to Eliza, his professional demeanor replacing his initial wonder. "I will buy this jar. I will pay you $1 for it." $1 was 10 times what Gable had offered. A gasp escaped someone at the back of the store. But Eliza did not move. She had done her arithmetic. She knew the labor, the bees, the uniqueness of her land. She met the man's gaze. "The price is $2 a jar," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And I have 42 more jars at my cabin." Mr. Abernathy did not haggle. He looked at her, then at the honey, and nodded. "Very well. I will take all of it." He followed her back to the cabin, Leo trailing behind them, his chest puffed with pride. The apothecary counted out $86 in gold and silver coin, a sum that made Eliza's hand tremble when she took it. He promised to return in the fall for the next harvest. As he was leaving, he paused and looked up at the purple-dusted hill. "They told me in town this land was worthless," he said. "They are mistaken. This land is a treasure." The news of the dark honey and the city apothecary traveled through the town like a grass fire. The mockery that had followed Eliza for a year curdled into a grudging, resentful curiosity. People looked at her hill differently now. They still saw a pile of rocks, but now they knew it held a secret they didn't understand. The town's perception began to pivot. She was no longer just the dreamer's daughter. She was the woman with the strange honey. The whispers changed. Foolish became peculiar. Peculiar became lucky, but luck, as Eliza knew, was just another word for work that others had been unwilling to do. She and Leo spent the autumn preparing the hives for winter, their work underscored by a new confidence. She bought a new axe, 2 strong milk goats from Mrs. Petrova, and enough flour and salt to last a year. The coins from Mr. Abernathy were a solid weight in their hiding place beneath the hearthstone, a bulwark against the coming cold. But as autumn bled into a mild, dry winter, a new kind of arithmetic began to occupy the minds of the townsfolk. The rain did not come. The winter wheat barely sprouted. The creeks, which should have been high, ran low and clear. Mrs. Petrova would stand at her fence line, sniffing the air. "No snow in the mountains," she would say, her face grim. "The sky is too clean. This is bad." By the following June, it was not just bad, it was a catastrophe. The sky remained a vast, empty bowl of blue, day after day after day. The sun beat down with a relentless fury. The pastures turned from green to yellow to a brittle, dusty brown. The corn in the fields grew to be a foot high, then withered on the stalk. The town's wells began to run low, the water drawn up tasting of mud and minerals. Mayor Thorne's herds of cattle, his primary source of wealth, wandered the barren fields, their ribs showing, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint. The confident swagger left the men of the town. Their conversations at the mercantile were no longer about land prices and crop yields, but about the cost of hay from other counties, about which wells were dry, and about the merciless, unchanging sky. Hunger changes a town. It strips away the veneer of neighborliness and reveals the sharp bones of desperation beneath. And in their desperation, they looked up at Eliza's hill. While their own land was dying, hers seemed perversely, stubbornly alive. The deep-rooted hyssop, adapted to dry, rocky soil, was thriving. Its purple flowers seemed even more vibrant against the scorched landscape. From dawn until dusk, the air around the hill hummed with the steady, industrious work of her bees. The sound was a constant reminder of her success and their failure. The resentment that had been simmering now came to a boil. They saw her goats, fat and healthy. They saw Leo hauling clear water from her spring, a spring that still flowed, slow and steady, from the heart of the hill. They saw the smoke from her chimney and imagined her counting her gold while they counted their debts. Thorne was the first to act. His desperation made him bold. He rode up to her cabin, his horse thin and agitated. He dismounted, foregoing any pretense of friendliness. "Your spring," he said, his voice flat. "It's drawing from the same aquifer as the town well. You're draining us dry." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Her spring was high on the hill, fed by a separate watershed. The town well was in the valley floor. "My spring is as it has always been," Eliza replied, her hands busy mending a bee veil. "The drought is the problem, Mr. Thorne. Not my hill. That hill is the only green place for miles," he shot back, his eyes scanning the property, hungry and assessing. "You have water. You have forage. My cattle are dying. I am sorry for your trouble," she said, and she was. She took no joy in his hardship. "But this is my land," he stared at her, his jaw tight. The smooth politician was gone, replaced by a man cornered by his own collapsing fortune. "We'll see about that," he muttered and rode away. A week later, Mr. Abernathy returned. The town watched his fine buggy roll through the square and up the track to Eliza's cabin. He bought her entire spring harvest, paying an even higher price than before. "A miracle," he called the honey. "In a drought, the nectar is even more concentrated. This is the finest batch, yet the sight of the apothecary's buggy leaving her cabin and the knowledge of the money he'd left behind was the final straw." The whispers turned venomous. She was a hoarder, a water witch. She was profiting from their misery. They forgot their earlier mockery and remembered only her current success. They forgot they had called the land worthless and now saw it as a treasure she was keeping from them. Being right is its own kind of reply, but it can be a lonely one. The pressure mounted. Silas Gable, whose shelves were growing bare, refused to sell her supplies on credit, demanding coin for every nail and every pound of sugar. Men who had once tipped their hats now stared at her with open hostility. They saw her small abundance not as the fruit of her labor, but as something stolen from them, a piece of luck that should have been theirs. Only Mrs. Petrova and Leo remained unchanged. "Let them look," the old woman said, watching a group of men confer by the town well, their gazes fixed on the hill. "A hungry dog barks at every shadow." Leo, however, was frightened. "They say the mayor is checking the land deeds at the courthouse," he told her one afternoon, his voice low. "He says your father's claim was never properly stamped." Eliza felt a cold, knot tighten in her stomach. She had trusted the paper the lawyer had given her. She had trusted her father's name. But she knew the power of a man like Thorne, especially over a town gripped by fear and envy. He could twist the law into any shape he desired. She spent that night not sleeping, but thinking. She sat by the cold hearth, the deed box on her lap. It contained the deed the lawyer had given her, the one for the 160 acres of the Shale Hill. But it also contained her father's other papers, old notebooks filled with his looping script, geological drawings of the watershed, and a thick, folded document tied with a faded ribbon. It was a second deed, one she had never understood. It was a federal land grant, much older, with a complex legal description that spoke of stone markers and creek beds and lines of longitude. She had always assumed it was a failed application, another of her father's abandoned dreams. Now, under the flickering lamplight, she read it again, tracing the arcane language with her finger. And as she read, the arithmetic of fear began to give way to a new calculation, the one of quiet, startling truth. The mayor called the town meeting on the steps of the courthouse. It was a summons, not an invitation. He stood before them, a pillar of civic authority, and laid out his case. He spoke of the community, of shared hardship, of the need for decisive action. He held up his map, pointing to the square that marked Eliza's land. He explained the legal loophole, the clerical error, the reversion of the land to the public trust. It was a masterful performance. He was not a thief. He was a savior, reclaiming a vital resource for his suffering people. And then he looked at Eliza, who had been summoned to stand before them all, and gave his verdict. The land will be auctioned tomorrow at noon. The proceeds will be used to buy hay for the town's livestock. A murmur of approval went through the crowd. It was a solution. It was hope. It did not matter that it was built on the ruin of one of their own. All eyes turned to her, waiting for her to break. This was the moment she had seen coming. This was the moment her father, in his own quiet way, had prepared her for. She stepped forward into the cleared space before the steps. The deed from the lawyer was in her left hand. The older, heavier document was in her right. She held up the first one. "This is the deed for the Shale Hill," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the still air. 160 acres. It is the land you all know. Thorne nodded, a magnanimous smile on his face. "Indeed, and sadly, it is improperly filed." "That may be," Eliza said, "but it doesn't matter, because it is not the only deed." She let that hang in the air for a moment. A confused ripple went through the crowd. Thorne's smile faltered. She then held up the second document, the old federal grant, its paper thick and yellowed. "This," she said, "is the original patent for this land, granted to my grandfather for his service in the war. It is not for 160 acres. It is for the entire upper watershed. 1,200 acres from the ridge line to the Black Creek Fork." She unfolded the document. A map, drawn in faded ink, was attached. "It includes the Shale Hill, yes, but it also includes the 4 springs that feed it, the timberline behind it, and the northern pasture you all assumed was public range." A collective gasp went through the crowd. 1,200 acres. It was more land than anyone in the valley owned, save for the railroad. Thorne's face went from confident to stunned to a sickly, mottled gray. He lunged forward and snatched the paper from her hand. His eyes, frantic now, scanned the legal description. The crowd watched him, their own hope turning to ash. They saw the truth dawn on his face, not as a discovery, but as a confirmation of something he already knew and had hoped to conceal. This is an antique," he stammered. "It's not valid. It was validated and stamped by the Federal Land Office 30 years ago," Eliza said calmly. "My father paid the taxes on it every year. He just never spoke of it. He knew people would not understand. He knew a man like you might one day try to take the part you could see, never guessing it was tied to the much larger part you could not." The mayor's eyes were fixed on the map, on the location of the deep springs. A man in the crowd, a rancher whose land bordered the high pasture, suddenly spoke. "The stone marker by the old oak. I always wondered what that was for." He was looking at the map, then at Eliza, his face a mask of dawning comprehension. Thorne's composure finally broke. "How did you know about the watershed?" he blurted out, the question an admission of his own greed, his own secret knowledge. He had known all along where the real water was. He had not been trying to save the town. He had been trying to seize the source. The crowd heard it. They saw it. The silence that followed was a crushing judgment. The mayor had not been outmaneuvered by a lawyer. He had been outwitted by a quiet woman, a forgotten piece of paper, and a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The mayor crumpled, not physically, But his authority, the smooth public mask he had worn for years, dissolved in the heat of that public square. He handed the deed back to Eliza as if it had burned his fingers and retreated into the courthouse without another word. The townsfolk stood in stunned silence, looking from the courthouse door to Eliza. They were left with their drought, their hunger, and the stark, uncomfortable knowledge of their own complicity. They had been ready to sacrifice her for their own salvation. Now they had nothing, and she, the woman they had mocked and resented, held everything. She held the water. She held the only thriving crop for 100 miles. She held the power. She could have named any price. She could have sold her honey for $1 a spoonful. She could have charged for every bucket of water drawn from the upper springs. She could have enacted a quiet, devastating revenge and called it business. For a day, she did nothing. She and Leo harvested honey, the rhythmic work of comfort and a balm. The next morning, she loaded her wagon with every jar of the dark, rich honey she possessed. She drove it not to the mercantile, but to the center of the town square, to the place where she had been judged. She set up a simple table. When a crowd gathered, drawn by curiosity and shame, she spoke. "The price of the honey is what it has always been," she announced. $2 a jar. But for those who have no coin, I will trade. A jar for a day's labor mending my fences. A jar for a sound shovel or a good axe head. A jar for 3 laying hens. A jar for a winter's worth of firewood, cut and stacked. It was not charity. It was a fair price, an offer of dignity. It was a way for them to earn, not beg. The first person to step forward was Silas Gable. His face was grim, his pride a palpable weight around him. He did not look her in the eye. "My wife, her cough is bad," he mumbled. "I have no coin. I need my wagon well mended," Eliza said gently. "It has a split spoke. Is it a fair trade for 2 jars? He looked up, his eyes filled with a relief so profound it was painful to see. He nodded, unable to speak. He took the jars and walked away with the stiff back of a man who had been given a reprieve. After him, others came forward. A woman traded a quilt. A blacksmith offered to shoe her goats. Men offered their labor. By the end of the day, the wagon was empty of honey but full of tools, promises, and a new, fragile kind of respect. She had done more than prove them wrong. She had chosen to bind them together when she could have profited from their ruin. That evening, as she and Leo were unloading the wagon, Mrs. Petrova came to the cabin. She carried a steaming bowl of stew. She looked at the collection of bartered goods, at the tired but peaceful look on Eliza's face. She nodded slowly, a deep and ancient wisdom in her eyes. "The ugliest root makes the sweetest tea," she said softly. "And a hard season can show you the true heart of a thing." The rains came a week later, a slow, soaking drizzle that turned the dust to dark, fragrant mud. But the drought had already done its work. It had broken the proud and humbled the greedy, and it had revealed what was truly of value. Not the wide, flat fields of corn, but the stubborn, rocky hill. Not the loud opinions of the majority, but the quiet, patient work of one. Eliza stood on her porch, the cool, damp air a blessing on her skin. She looked out over her land, the 1,200 acres of it, and saw not a conquest, but a responsibility. The bees were settling in for the night, their hum a low, contented thrum that was the true sound of her home. She was not a woman alone on a worthless hill. She was the heart of a place that was just beginning to understand its own worth.